Number 1. Gwendolyn Graham and Catherine Wood. Love, power, and murder in the nursing home. There are crimes that shake the very foundation of human trust. Crimes that force society to confront the darkest possibilities lurking behind the most ordinary facades. And then there are crimes so calculated, so deeply rooted in psychological manipulation and shared madness, that they leave investigators, prosecutors, and ordinary people alike struggling to comprehend how human beings could descend to such depths. And the story of Gwendolyn Graham and Catherine Wood is precisely that kind of crime, a story that begins not with violence but with intimacy, not with hatred but with a twisted, obsessive love that ultimately consumed 5 innocent elderly lives inside the walls of a place that was supposed to represent safety, compassion, and care. The Alpine Manor nursing home in Walker, Michigan, was by all outward appearances a perfectly ordinary care facility. The kind of place where families brought their most vulnerable loved ones when they could no longer manage their care at home, where elderly men and women spent their final years surrounded by staff they trusted to treat them with dignity and kindness. And it was here, in the corridors and rooms of this facility, that Gwendolyn Graham and Catherine Wood carried out one of the most disturbing series of murders in the history of American healthcare, a killing spree that lasted for months, that was fueled by a grotesque romantic bond between 2 women, and that only came to light years later through a confession born out of a relationship that had already collapsed under the weight of its own darkness. Gwendolyn Graham was born in 1963 in California, and by the time she arrived at Alpine Manor as a nurse's aide in the mid-1980s, she carried within her a personality that would later be described by psychologists and investigators as deeply disturbed, someone who craved control and power in ways that ordinary life could never satisfy, someone whose emotional landscape was defined by intensity, manipulation, and a capacity for cruelty that she kept carefully hidden beneath a surface that colleagues initially found unremarkable. Catherine was born in 1962 in Michigan, and when she met Graham at Alpine Manor, she was a heavy-set woman working as a supervisor at the facility, someone who described herself as lonely, emotionally vulnerable, and desperately seeking connection. And when Graham turned her attention toward Wood, the result was an immediate and overwhelming romantic obsession that Wood later described as the most consuming relationship of her life, a bond so powerful that it overrode her judgment, her conscience, and ultimately her basic human decency. The 2 women became inseparable, and as their relationship deepened through 1986 and into 1987, Graham began to introduce into their dynamic a darkness that would later claim disturb her even as she found herself unable to resist it, a fascination with death, with power over life, with the idea of taking something irreplaceable from another human being and binding themselves together through that act in a way that nothing else could replicate. And it was Graham who first proposed what Wood would later describe in court as a pact, a shared secret that would tie them together forever, the idea of killing patients in their care and using the first letter of each victim's last name to spell out the word murder, a grotesque trophy system that speaks to profound psychological dysfunction driving Graham's behavior and to the terrifying extent to which Wood allowed herself to be drawn into that dysfunction. The victims of Gwendolyn Graham and Catherine were elderly, frail, and in many cases suffering from conditions that made them unable to resist or even fully comprehend what was being done to them. And this was by design, because Graham specifically selected patients who she believed would be least able to fight back, least able to draw attention, and whose deaths would be most easily attributed to natural causes given their already compromised health. And between January and April of 1987, Graham suffocated at least 5 patients inside Alpine Manor, in most cases pressing a washcloth over their faces while they lay in their beds, holding it there until they stopped breathing, and would, by her own later admission, serve as a lookout during at least some of these murders, standing in the hallway to ensure that no other staff members approached while Graham completed her killing inside the room. The 5 confirmed victims were Marguerite Chambers, age 60 years old, Myrtle Luce, age 95, Mae Mason, age 79, Belle Burkhard, age 74, and Edith Cook, age 60, and each of these women have been entrusted to the care of Alpine Manor by families who believed their loved ones were safe, who visited them and held their hands, and said their goodbyes, never knowing that the person responsible for their deaths was a young woman in scrubs who walked the same hallways every shift and who felt not remorse but excitement at what she had done. What makes the psychology of this case so uniquely disturbing is the way in which the killings function within a relationship between Graham and Wood. Because according to Wood's own testimony, Graham described the act of killing as sexually exciting, as a source of intense pleasure and power, and Wood testified that after committing murders, Graham would return home in a state of heightened arousal, that the killings had become intertwined in Graham's mind with intimacy and control, and that Wood, despite her later claims of horror and reluctance, participated in this dynamic in ways that made her legally and morally culpable even if she never physically suffocated anyone herself. The murders stopped in the spring of 1987, apparently because the two women had abandoned their plan to spell murder with victims' initials after finding that the specific patients whose names fit the pattern were proving more difficult to isolate, and life at Alpine Manor continued with no official investigation, no suspicion, and no justice of the 5 women who had been murdered in their beds, their deaths recorded as natural, their families given no reason to doubt that conclusion, and Graham and Wood continued their relationship for a time before it deteriorated and eventually ended, with Graham moving to Tyler, Texas, where she entered into a new relationship and tried to build a new life. It was the unraveling of their relationship that ultimately led to the exposure of the murders, because in 1988, Catherine Wood, by then separated from Graham and carrying the weight of what she knew, confided in her ex-husband Ken Wood, telling him that she and Graham had killed patients at Alpine Manor, and Ken Wood, to his credit, went to the police, and the investigation that followed was unlike almost anything law enforcement in Michigan had encountered before, because there were no bodies to exhume that would easily yield evidence of suffocation, no forensic markers left behind on victims whose deaths had been certified as natural, and investigators had to build their case almost entirely on testimony, confession, and the painstaking reconstruction of events from years earlier. Michigan State Police detectives traveled to Texas to interview Graham, who denied everything, and they worked through the record of Alpine Manor to identify which patients had died during the relevant period, interviewing former staff members who recalled unusual patterns of deaths on certain shifts, but who had never connected those patterns to anything sinister. Catherine would agree to cooperate with prosecutors and ultimately pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in 1988, receiving a sentence of 20 to 40 years in prison in exchange for her testimony against Graham. And Wood's cooperation was essential to the prosecution's case because without her detailed account of what had happened inside those rooms, the physical evidence alone would likely have been insufficient to convict anyone. Gwendolyn Graham was extradited to Michigan and stood trial in 1989, and the trial was a deeply disturbing proceeding in which jurors heard her describe in graphic detail the methodology of the murders, the way Graham had practiced on patients before completing the killings, the way the two women had discussed their crimes afterward, and the way Graham had reacted to the act of taking a life. And former colleagues testified about behavioral patterns they had observed but not understood, about Graham's unusual comfort with death and her disturbing habit of fondling patients' bodies, about the atmosphere of the facility and the opportunities it provided to someone willing to exploit the vulnerability of those in its care. Graham's defense argued that it was lying to secure a favorable deal, that she had fabricated the entire story out of jealousy and spite following the breakdown of their relationship, and Graham herself maintained her innocence throughout the trial. But the jury did not find her credible, and after deliberating, they returned a verdict of guilty on 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder, and Judge Roman Snow sentenced Gwendolyn Graham to 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, a sentence that ensured she would never again have access to vulnerable people in her care. Catherine would serve her sentence and became eligible for parole, and her case raised significant questions about the culpability of those who facilitate murder without physically committing it, about what it means to be complicit in evil, and about how someone like Wood could have allowed herself to participate in something so monstrous even under the influence of a manipulative partner. The case also prompted serious scrutiny of hiring and oversight practices at care facilities across the United States, raising questions about how Graham had been able to continue working at Alpine Manor without anyone connecting the pattern of deaths on her shifts to deliberate action, about why no one had flagged her behavior or investigated the unusual mortality rate, and about what systemic failures had allowed 5 women to be murdered in a licensed care facility without triggering any alarm. For the families of Marguerite Chambers, Myrtle Luce, Mae Mason, Belle Burkhard, and Edith Cook, the revelation that their loved ones had been deliberately murdered was a trauma layered upon grief, a reckoning with the knowledge that the people they had trusted with their most vulnerable family members had instead treated those lives as instruments of their own psychological gratification. and the lasting impact of this case on American healthcare regulation, on background check requirements for care workers, and on the culture of vigilance within nursing homes and assisted living facilities is a part of the legacy of 5 women whose deaths should never have happened and whose stories deserve to be remembered not as footnotes in the tale of criminal psychology, but as the human heart of a tragedy that exposes what happens when the systems meant to protect the most vulnerable among us fail completely and catastrophically. Number 2, Richard Angelo, the angel of death who played God in his own hospital. There are few betrayals more profound than that of a healer who harms, a person who has taken an oath to preserve life, and who instead uses the knowledge, the access, and the trust granted by that oath to destroy it. And Richard Angelo stands as one of the most chilling examples of this particular form of evil in the recorded history of American medicine. A man who worked as a nurse at Good Samaritan Hospital in West Islip, New York, who was regarded by many of his colleagues as competent and dedicated, who had even served as a captain in the volunteer fire department and wore that identity as a badge of community service and respectability, and who secretly injected patients in his care with paralyzing drugs so that he could then attempt to resuscitate them, manufacturing medical emergencies out of whole cloth, so that he could step in as a hero, so that he could feel the rush of being needed, of being capable, of being seen as the person who stood between a patient and death, never fully reckoning with the fact that he himself was the one pushing those patients toward the edge, that the emergencies he was responding to were emergencies of his own deliberate creation, and that the patients who did not survive his interventions had been robbed of their lives by the very person whose hands they were trusting with their most fragile moments. Richard Angelo was born in 1962 and grew up in New York, and by the time he completed his nursing training and joined the staff at Good Samaritan Hospital, he had constructed for himself an identity built around competence and heroism, around being the person who could handle crises, who remained calm under pressure, who knew what to do when others panicked. And this identity was not merely a professional aspiration, but a psychological need, something deeply embedded in his sense of self-worth and his ability to feel valuable. It was this need, this desperate craving for recognition and significance, that investigators and psychologists would later identify as the engine driving his crimes, a condition sometimes described in forensic psychology as hero syndrome or Munchausen syndrome by proxy in a professional context, where the perpetrator creates the very crisis they then attempt to resolve in order to experience the emotional reward of being the rescuer. Angelo began working at Good Samaritan in the mid-1980s, and it was during his overnight shifts on the cardiac care unit that he began his pattern of injecting patients with Pavulon, a brand name for pancuronium bromide, which is a neuromuscular blocking agent used in surgical settings to temporarily paralyze muscles during procedures and which, when administered outside of a controlled surgical context without mechanical ventilation, causes the patient to become completely paralyzed and unable to breathe, inducing a state of suffocation that mimics a sudden medical emergency and that without immediate intervention will result in death. And Angelo would administer this drug to patients who were already vulnerable, already in the hospital because their bodies were struggling, and then he would either respond to the emergency himself or ensure that he was present and visible when other staff rushed to help, positioning himself as a capable, decisive nurse who stepped up in a crisis. The pattern of unexpected emergencies and deaths on Angelo's shifts began to accumulate through 1987 and into the autumn of that year. And while individual incidents might have been explained away as a tragic but inevitable reality of caring for critically ill patients, the sheer frequency of crises occurring specifically when Angelo was on duty was a statistical anomaly that would eventually prove impossible to ignore, though for a troublingly long period it was in fact ignored, or at least not acted upon with the urgency that the situation demanded. And this delay in recognition is itself one of the most disturbing aspects of the case, a reminder that institutions often resist acknowledging the possibility that someone within their walls is causing harm, that the cognitive dissonance required to suspect a colleague of deliberate murder is so great that warning signs can be present for months before anyone connects them into a coherent picture. The case broke open in October of 1987 when a patient named Girolamo Cusick survived one of Angelo's injections and was able to provide investigators with a crucial piece of evidence, because Cusick, despite having been paralyzed and unable to speak or move during the episode, had remained conscious throughout the ordeal, trapped inside a body that would not respond to his commands, aware of what was happening to him but completely unable to communicate or resist. And after he recovered, he, reported to hospital administration that he believed someone had injected him with something, and this report triggered an investigation that would unravel everything Angelo had done. When hospital security searched Angelo's locker following Cusick's complaint, they discovered vials of pavulon and another drug called anectine, another neuromuscular blocking agent. Drugs that had no legitimate reason to be stored in a nurse's personal locker rather than in the hospital's secure medication dispensary. And this discovery was immediately reported to law enforcement. And Suffolk County police and prosecutors began what would become an extensive forensic and investigative effort to determine the full scope of what Angelo had done and to identify his victims. The forensic challenge facing investigators was immense because neuromuscular blocking agents like pavulon do not remain detectable in the body for extended periods under normal circumstances, and many of Angelo's suspected victims had already been buried, meaning that exhumation and specialized toxicological testing would be required to find evidence of the drugs, and the science of detecting these substances in decomposed tissue was not nearly as advanced in the late 1980s as it would later become, meaning that prosecutors faced a difficult task of building a case in which the physical evidence was partial, contested, and depended on cutting-edge forensic techniques that had not yet been widely tested in American courts. Despite these challenges, investigators exhumed the bodies of several patients who had died under suspicious circumstances during Angelo's shifts, and forensic toxicologists were able to detect traces of pavulon in some of the exhumed remains, providing physical corroboration for what the circumstantial evidence already strongly suggested, and a combination of the drugs found in Angelo's locker, the toxicological findings from exhumed victims, the statistical pattern of emergencies on his shifts, and the testimony of Girolamo Cusick formed the foundation of the prosecution's case against him. Richard Angelo was arrested in late 1987 and charged with murder, and in the period between his arrest and his trial, he gave investigators something they had not fully anticipated, a confession of sorts, in which he acknowledged injecting patients with drugs, but framed his actions in psychological terms that reflected his distorted self-understanding, telling investigators that he had wanted to be seen as a good nurse, that he had felt inadequate and had needed opportunities to demonstrate his skills, that he had not intended for patients to die, but had simply wanted to resuscitate them successfully, as though the fact that he had not consciously desired their deaths somehow diminished his responsibility for creating the conditions that led to them. And this statement, while not a full admission of intentional murder, was deeply damaging to his defense and revealed the psychological architecture of his crimes with a clarity that no external analysis could have matched. The trial of Richard Angelo took place in 1989 and was a lengthy, technically complex proceeding in which the defense challenged the forensic evidence extensively, arguing that the detection of pavulon in exhumed remains was scientifically unreliable and that the prosecution's case rested on flawed toxicology, and the prosecution countered with expert witnesses who defended their methodology and with the overwhelming weight of circumstantial evidence pointing to Angelo as the source of the emergencies on his unit. Witnesses testified about the statistical improbability of so many crises occurring on a single nurse's shift by chance, about Angelo's behavior during and after emergencies, about the way he had positioned himself to be present and visible when resuscitation efforts were underway, and about the culture of the unit during the period of his crimes. And the picture that emerged was a man who had systematically endangered and killed the patients in his care while carefully maintaining the appearance of a dedicated and capable nurse. The jury found Richard Angelo guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree manslaughter, 1 count of criminally negligent homicide, and 6 counts of assault, and in 1989, Judge Alfred Robbins sentenced him to 61 years to life in prison, a sentence that reflected the gravity of his crimes and the number of lives he had damaged or destroyed. And Angelo has remained incarcerated at a New York State correctional facility, becoming eligible for parole consideration in later years, but remaining in prison as of the time of this account. His case continuing to serve as a reference point in discussions of healthcare serial killing and the psychological profiles of medical professionals who harm patients. The victims of Richard Angelo were people who had entered Good Samaritan Hospital in the expectation that the staff there would work to heal them. People who were already frightened and vulnerable and who placed their trust in the institution and in the individuals who represented it. And the fact that this trust was so catastrophically violated by someone who had been granted access to their most helpless moments is a wound that goes beyond the individual tragedies of each victim and speaks to something fundamental about the social contract underlying medical care, about the implicit promise that those who enter a hospital will be protected from harm by the people employed to care for them. The case prompted regulatory changes in how hospitals monitor patient emergencies and track patterns that might indicate staff-related harm, and it contributed to the development of protocols for investigating unusual mortality rates on specific shifts or units, though as subsequent cases would demonstrate with painful regularity, the healthcare system's ability to detect and respond to medical serial killers remains imperfect and continues to be tested by perpetrators whose access to vulnerable patients and whose professional legitimacy make them uniquely difficult to identify and stop before they have caused irreparable harm to the people who trusted them most completely and who deserve nothing less than the full protection of the institutions claiming to serve them. Number 3, Beverly Alit, the nurse who murdered children in their hospital beds. There are crimes that defy the most basic instincts of human civilization, act so contrary to everything that society holds sacred that they force even the most composed and rational minds into a state of disbelief. And the crimes of Beverly Alit occupy a place in that darkest category, not merely because of the calculated cruelty with which they were carried out, not merely because of the vulnerability of the victims, but because of the specific context in which they occurred, a pediatric ward in a National Health Service hospital in England, a place where sick children were brought by terrified parents who surrendered their most precious people into the hands of medical professionals and trusted completely that those professionals would do everything in their power to help them heal. And Beverly Alit, dressed in her nurse's uniform, moving to the ward with the quiet authority of someone who belonged there, exploited that trust in the most devastating way imaginable, injecting children with lethal doses of insulin and potassium, suffocating them, causing cardiac arrests in small bodies that had done nothing to deserve such treatment, and doing all of this not out of mercy, not out of ideology, not even out of the twisted hero complex that drove some of her predecessors in the grim history of medical killing, but out of a profound psychological dysfunction so deep and so consuming that it had warped her relationship with reality itself, turning the suffering of children into a means of satisfying needs that she herself may never have been fully able to articulate or understand. Beverly Alit was born on October 4th, 1968, in Grantham, Lincolnshire, and her childhood and adolescence were marked by a pattern of behavior that, when examined in retrospect, carries unmistakable warning signs of serious psychological disturbance that would eventually manifest in murder, though at the time these signs were either not recognized for what they were, or were not acted upon with the urgency they warranted. From a young age, Alit exhibited what mental health professionals would later identify as classic symptoms of a condition known as Munchausen syndrome, a factitious disorder in which a person fabricates or induces illness in themselves in order to receive medical attention, sympathy, and care. And throughout her teenage years and young adulthood, Alit made repeated visits to doctors and hospitals complaining of ailments that could not be verified, displaying wounds and injuries that showed signs of deliberate self-infliction, and seeking the attention and nurturing that medical settings provided with a frequency and intensity that went far beyond anything that could be explained by ordinary anxiety about health. She accumulated an extraordinary medical history of unverified complaints and unexplained injuries, including abscesses, appendicitis, urinary tract infections, and various other conditions, and some of her healthcare providers noted inconsistencies in her presentations that suggested deliberate fabrication. But the systemic response to these concerns was inadequate, and when Alit applied to train as a nurse, her troubled medical history did not prevent her from being accepted into the profession, a failure that would have catastrophic consequences for the children who came under her care. Alit trained as a nurse in the late 1980s, and in early 1991 obtained a position as an enrolled nurse on Ward 4 Grantham and Kesteven Hospital in Lincolnshire, a children's ward that was at the time understaffed and under pressure, a ward where a new employee willing to take on extra shifts and demonstrate enthusiasm would be welcome without the level of scrutiny that a more adequately resourced institution might have applied. And it was on this ward, between February and April of 1991, that Alit carried out the attacks that would result in the deaths of 4 children and the serious injury of 9 others, a concentrated burst of violence against the most vulnerable possible victims that lasted just under 3 months and that left families, colleagues, and an entire community shattered. The first victim was Liam Taylor, a 7-week-old infant who was admitted to Ward 4 on February 23, 1991, suffering from a chest infection, a condition serious enough to require hospitalization, but not one that should have been life-threatening. And within hours of his admission, Liam suffered cardiac arrest that left him severely brain damaged, and he died on March 5, 1991, and his parents, Paul and Joan Taylor, were devastated but had no reason at that point to suspect anything other than a tragic deterioration of their son's condition. No reason to imagine that the nurse who had been caring for him had deliberately caused a crisis that ended his life. The second victim was Timothy Hardwick, an 11-year-old boy with cerebral palsy who was admitted to Ward 4 on March 5, 1991, the same day that Liam Taylor died, suffering from an epileptic seizure, and Timothy suffered cardiac arrest while in Lit's care and died. And again, the death was attributed to his existing medical conditions. And again, no suspicion fell on the nurse who had been present. Kaylee Desmond was 5 months old when she was admitted to Ward 4 in March of 1991. And she survived the attack Alit perpetrated against her, though she suffered cardiac arrest and required emergency resuscitation. And it was later established that Alit had injected air into Kaylee's body, a method that causes an air embolism capable of inducing cardiac arrest. And the fact that Kaylee survived was due entirely to the speed and effectiveness of the resuscitation efforts undertaken by her colleagues, not any mercy on Alit's part. Paul Crampton was 5 months old when he was admitted in April of 1991, and he suffered 3 separate hypoglycemic episodes while in Alit's care, each one bringing him close to death. And investigators would later establish that these episodes were caused by injections of insulin, a drug that in the doses Alit administered would drive blood sugar to dangerously low levels and cause seizures, unconsciousness, and potentially fatal organ failure. And Paul survived, though the repeated assaults on his tiny body left a legacy of medical consequences that his family would have to navigate for years. Bradley Gibson was 5 years old when he was admitted in April of 1991 suffering from pneumonia, and he suffered a cardiac arrest while under Alit's care and survived after resuscitation. And Wayake Hung Chan, known as Henry, was 2 years old when he too suffered a suspicious cardiac arrest on Ward 4. And he survived but sustained brain damage as a result of the oxygen deprivation caused by the arrest, and the accumulation of these incidents on a single ward over such a short period was beginning to create a pattern that could not indefinitely be attributed to coincidence, though the full weight of what that pattern implied was still not being confronted directly. Becky Phillips was one of twins, born prematurely, and she was admitted to Ward 4 in April of 1991 after being discharged and then readmitted following concerns about her health. And Becky died on April 3, 1991, after suffering cardiac arrest while in Alit's care, and her twin sister Katie was also targeted by Alit and suffered such severe injuries, including a fractured arm that occurred under circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained, and damage to her brain from oxygen deprivation, that she was left with permanent disabilities, and the grief of Becky and Katie's mother, Sue Phillips, who had already been through the terror of premature birth and who had trusted Ward 4 with both of her daughters, is almost impossible to contemplate without being overwhelmed by the scale of what Alit took from that family. Claire Peck was 15 months old when she was admitted to Ward 4 on April 22, 1991, suffering from asthma, and she was the last of Alit's victims to die, suffering 2 cardiac arrests in rapid succession while in Alit's care, the second of which proved fatal. And it was the death of Claire Peck that finally triggered the formal investigation that would eventually lead to Alit's arrest, because by this point the sheer number of cardiac arrests and unexpected deaths on Ward 4 had reached a point where the Lincolnshire police were called in to investigate, and their investigation, combined with a review of blood samples taken from some of the surviving victims, began to reveal the truth of what had been happening on the ward. The forensic investigation was complex and painstaking, because proving that a child's cardiac arrest was deliberately induced rather than the result of natural causes requires establishing the presence of a foreign substance in the body or demonstrating that the circumstances of the arrest are inconsistent with the child's known medical condition. And in several cases, investigators were able to do exactly this, finding abnormal insulin levels in blood samples taken from some of the victims and detecting the presence of potassium in quantities inconsistent with natural causes in others. And these findings, combined with the statistical impossibility of so many cardiac arrests occurring on a single ward during the shifts of a single nurse, formed the basis of the case against Alit. Beverly Alit was arrested in November of 1991 and charged with murder, attempted murder, and causing grievous bodily harm. In the period leading to her trial, she was also diagnosed with Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition now more commonly referred to as factitious disorder imposed on another, in which a caregiver deliberately induces illness in someone in their care in order to gain attention and sympathy. And this diagnosis provided a psychological framework for understanding her crimes, though it did not and could not excuse them. And the question of how someone with such a documented history of psychological disturbance had been permitted to work with vulnerable children remained a source of profound institutional shame. The trial of Beverly Alit began in 1993 at Nottingham Crown Court, and it was a proceeding of extraordinary emotional intensity, with parents of the victims sitting in the courtroom and hearing detailed medical and forensic testimony about what had been done to their children. And Alit pleaded guilty to 4 counts of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, and 6 counts of causing grievous bodily harm with intent. And Justice Latham, in sentencing her, described her crimes as of unparalleled gravity and imposed 13 concurrent life sentences, with a recommendation that she serve a minimum of 40 years before being considered for release, a recommendation that was later increased by the Home Secretary to a minimum of 30 years. And Alit was subsequently transferred to Rampton Secure Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility, where she has remained, receiving treatment for her psychological conditions, while the families of her victims have continued to live with the consequences of what she did. The aftermath of the Alit case produced a Clothier report, an independent inquiry conducted by Sir Cecil Clothier that examined the circumstances that had allowed Alit to obtain employment as a nurse despite her history of psychological problems and unexplained medical presentations. And the report made a series of recommendations about pre-employment health screening for those seeking to work in the National Health Service, about the monitoring of sickness absence records, and about the systems that should be in place to detect and investigate unusual patterns of patient harm on hospital wards. And these recommendations led to significant changes in NHS hiring and monitoring practices. Those subsequent cases of healthcare serial killing in the United Kingdom demonstrated that the lessons of the Alit case had not been fully absorbed by the system. For the families of Liam Taylor, Timothy Hardwick, Becky Phillips, and Claire Peck, and for the families of the 9 children who survived Alit's attacks, but who carried the physical and psychological consequences of those attacks into their futures, justice was done in the formal legal sense, and Alit was held accountable and imprisoned for what she had done, but no sentence, no inquiry, no set of procedural reforms can restore what was taken from those families, cannot give back the children who died, cannot undo the disabilities suffered by those who survived, cannot repair the trust that was shattered when the place of healing became a place of deliberate harm. And the story of Beverly Alit endures as one of the most devastating reminders in modern British history of what happens when the systems designed to protect the most vulnerable fail, when the warning signs of profound psychological disturbance are not acted upon, and when children who deserved only care and compassion were instead met with calculated cruelty from the one person in the room whose entire purpose was supposed to be their protection and their healing. Number 4, Winetta Hoyt, the mother who smothered 5 children and fooled an entire medical community. There are cases in the annals of criminal justice that do not merely shock the conscience, but fundamentally alter the way that science, medicine, and law understand the boundaries between tragedy and crime, between grief and guilt, between the appearance of victimhood and the reality of perpetration. And the case of Winetta Hoyt is precisely such a case, a story so deeply disturbing in its particulars, so far-reaching in its implications for medical science and forensic understanding, and so devastating in its human dimensions that it forced an entire generation of pediatric researchers and legal professionals to confront an uncomfortable truth that the medical community had for decades been unwilling to fully examine, namely that the sudden and unexplained deaths of multiple children within a single family, deaths that had been attributed to a natural cause and that had in fact been used as the scientific foundation for a widely accepted medical theory, were in reality murders, deliberate acts of suffocation carried out by a mother against her own children over the course of nearly a decade, a series of killings that had not only gone undetected and unpunished for more than 20 years, but that had inadvertently contributed to a body of medical literature that had itself caused harm by providing cover for other cases of child murder across the country and around the world. Winnetta Hoyt was born in 1946 in rural upstate New York, and she grew up in modest circumstances in the small communities of Tioga County, where she eventually married a man named Timothy Hoyt and settled into a life that from the outside appeared ordinary, a young couple building a family in a quiet corner of America, though the reality of what was happening inside that family between 1965 and 1971 was something that the community around them, the doctors who treated the children, and the researchers who later cited the family's tragedies in academic papers were completely and catastrophically wrong about. Winnetta and Timothy Hoyt had 5 children over the course of 6 years, and all 5 of those children died in infancy or early childhood, each death attributed at the time to natural causes, and the sequence of these deaths, their timing, and the circumstances surrounding them would not be seriously questioned for more than 2 decades, during which time the medical establishment treated the Hoyt family not as a subject of criminal suspicion, but as a source of scientific data about a condition that was itself only beginning to be understood and defined. The first child, Eric, was born in October of 1964 and died in January of 1965 at the age of 3 months. His death attributed to respiratory failure, and the grief of a young mother losing her first infant was met with sympathy and compassion by everyone around her, including the medical professionals who had cared for Eric and who had no reason at that point to look beyond the natural explanation for his death. The second child, Julie, was born in July of 1968 and died in September of 1968 at the age of approximately 2 months. Her death similarly attributed to natural causes. And again, Winnetta Hoyt was seen as a grieving mother, a woman suffering an almost incomprehensible double tragedy. And the community and the medical system responded with the sympathy and support that such apparent grief seemed to demand. James, the third child, was born in July of 1966 and died in September of 1968, and Molly was born in March of 1970 and died in June of 1970 at the age of just under 3 months, and Noah, the fifth child, was born in May of 1971 and died in July of 1971 at the age of approximately 2.5 months. And by the time Noah died, the Hoyt family had lost 5 children in 6 years, each to sudden unexplained death, each at a young age, and the cumulative tragedy was staggering by any measure, and yet was interpreted by those closest to the case not as a pattern demanding criminal investigation, but as a medical phenomenon warranting scientific study. The reason that the deaths of the Hoyt children were not initially treated as suspicious is directly connected to the work of a pediatric researcher named Alfred Steinschneider, who was at the time studying the relationship between sleep apnea and sudden infant death syndrome, and who became involved with the Hoyt family when 2 of the later children, Molly and Noah, were enrolled in his research program at the Upstate Medical Center in Syracuse, and Steinschneider observed both children, experiencing episodes of apnea, periods where they stopped breathing temporarily, during their time in his care, and when both children subsequently died. Steinschneider interpreted their deaths as evidence supporting his hypothesis that prolonged apnea was a precursor to sudden infant death syndrome, and in 1972 he published a landmark paper in the journal Pediatrics in which he described the cases of 2 siblings, identified by pseudonyms but later confirmed to be Molly and Noah Hoyt, whose repeated apnea episodes and subsequent deaths he presented as evidence for the apnea hypothesis. Steinschneider's 1972 paper was enormously influential in the field of pediatric medicine and became one of the most cited papers in the history of sudden infant death syndrome research, and the hypothesis advanced that sleep apnea was a predictor of sudden infant death syndrome, and that the condition had a familial component, shaped research, clinical practice, and public health policy for more than 2 decades, leading to the widespread use of home apnea monitors for infants considered at risk and contributing to the idea that families who had lost multiple children to sudden infant death syndrome were experiencing a genetic or physiological predisposition to the condition rather than something more sinister. The problem with this entire edifice of research and policy was that its foundational case, the Hoyt family, was not a case of sudden infant death syndrome at all, but a case of serial child murder, and the apnea episodes that Steinschneider had observed in Molly and Noah during their time in his care had not been natural events, but the residual effects of repeated suffocation at their mother's hands. And the deaths that followed were not natural deaths, but murders, and the paper that Stein-Schneider had built on the foundation of these cases was therefore not evidence of medical phenomenon, but an inadvertent monument to the ease with which murder can be disguised as tragedy when the perpetrator is trusted, when the victims cannot speak for themselves, and when the system examining the evidence is looking to the wrong lens entirely. The case against Winetta Hoyt began to unravel in the early 1990s, largely through the work of a district attorney named William Fitzpatrick, who had become deeply skeptical of the multiple sudden infant death syndrome explanation for families who had lost more than one child, and who had encountered the Stein-Schneider paper and become convinced that the cases it described warranted reinvestigation. And Fitzpatrick worked with investigators from the New York State Police to reopen the Hoyt cases. And the investigation that followed was a painstaking reconstruction of events that had occurred more than 20 years earlier, relying on medical records, witness interviews, and a growing body of forensic understanding about the mechanisms and detectability of suffocation in infants that had not existed at the time of the original deaths. The investigators focused significant attention on developing a relationship with Timothy Hoyt, Winetta's husband, who had been present in the household during the deaths of his children, but who investigators believe may not have been aware of what his wife was doing. And as the investigation progressed, it became increasingly clear that Timothy Hoyt had genuinely believed his children's deaths were natural, that he had never suspected his wife, and that he was himself a victim of her deception, in a profound and heartbreaking sense. The breakthrough in the case came on March 23, 1994, when New York State Police investigators sat down with Winetta Hoyt for what was presented as a routine follow-up interview related to the ongoing research into sudden infant death syndrome. And in the course of that interview, under the patient and skilled questioning of investigators who had spent years preparing for this moment, Winetta Hoyt began to confess, and what emerged over the course of that conversation was a detailed and devastating account of how she had killed each of her 5 children, smothering them with a pillow or her shoulder when they would not stop crying, acting impulsively in moments of frustration and exhaustion, but doing so repeatedly, doing so to 5 different children over the course of 6 years. Doing so and then presenting herself to the world as a grieving mother and to the medical community as a research subject whose family's tragedies might help unlock the mysteries of sudden infant death syndrome. Hoyt's confession was detailed and specific, covering each child individually and describing the method she had used in each case, and it was recorded and later used as the centerpiece of the prosecution's case against her, though her defense attorneys would subsequently argue that the confession had been coerced, that their client had been psychologically manipulated into making statements that did not accurately reflect the truth, and that the investigators had taken advantage of a vulnerable woman who was easily led and who had said what she believed the investigators wanted to hear rather than what had actually happened. Winetta Hoyt was arrested and charged with 5 counts of second-degree murder, and her trial in 1995 was a proceeding of enormous significance not only for the families directly affected, but for the broader medical and legal communities who understood that its outcome would have implications far beyond the specific facts of the Hoyt case, because embedded within the trial was a fundamental question about the reliability of the sudden infant death syndrome diagnosis in cases involving multiple sibling deaths, about the responsibility of the medical community when scientific research is built on cases that may involve criminal conduct, and about what the justice system owed to 5 children who had been murdered and whose deaths had been attributed to natural causes for more than 2 decades. The prosecution presented a confession, supported by medical experts who testified that the probability of 5 children in a single family dying of natural sudden infant death syndrome was statistically infinitesimal, and who argued that the pattern of deaths, combined with Hoyt's own detailed account of what she had done, left no reasonable doubt about her guilt. And the defense countered with experts who challenged the reliability of the confession and who argued that the statistical evidence was being misapplied. But the jury was not persuaded by the defense's arguments, and after deliberating, they returned a verdict of guilty on all 5 counts of second-degree murder. Judge Vincent Segueglia sentenced Winetta Hoyt to 75 years to life in prison, a sentence that ensured she would in all likelihood spend the remainder of her life incarcerated, and Hoyt did in fact die in prison in August of 1998, at the age of 52, never having publicly reconciled or confessed actions with the identity she had constructed for herself as a grieving mother, and leaving behind a husband who had lost not only his 5 children, but ultimately his wife to the consequences of crimes he had never suspected were being committed within his own home. The aftermath of the Hoyt case extended far beyond the walls of the courtroom and the boundaries of Tioga County. because the conviction had direct implications for the Stein-Schneider paper and for the decades of sudden infant death syndrome research that had been built upon it, prompting a fundamental reassessment of the multiple sibling sudden infant death syndrome hypothesis and contributing to the development of new guidelines within pediatric medicine about how to approach cases in which more than one child in a family has died unexpectedly, guidelines that acknowledge for the first time in an official and systematic way that such cases warrant consideration of the possibility of non-accidental harm rather than automatic attribution to natural causes. Alfred Stein-Schneider himself never accepted that the children described in his 1972 paper had been murdered, and he maintained until his death that his research had been sound and his conclusions valid, a position that became increasingly untenable as the forensic and legal evidence accumulated against Hoyt, but that reflected the profound difficulty that any scientist faces when confronted with evidence that the foundation of their life's work may have been built on something fundamentally false. For Timothy Hoyt, the aftermath of his wife's conviction was a landscape of grief so complex and so layered that it defies easy description. A man who had buried 5 children while believing their deaths were natural, who had lived for decades with a woman he trusted and loved without knowing what she had done, and who was then forced to reconstruct his entire understanding of his own life and marriage in light of facts that shattered every assumption he had made and the humanity of his position. The completeness of his victimization in the hands of someone he had trusted absolutely serves as a reminder that the crimes of Winnetta Hoyt did not claim only the 5 lives she ended, but damaged and distorted the lives of everyone connected to her, and that the decades of scientific misdirection that her crimes inadvertently caused represented a harm that extended into the lives of countless families who deserved better from the systems that were supposed to protect them and tell them the truth. Number 5. Charles Cullen, the nurse who killed across 2 states for 15 years and confessed to 40 murders. There are criminals whose stories force society to confront not just the evil of a single individual, but the systemic failures that enable that evil to persist, to multiply, and to claim victim after victim across years and decades, while the institutions that should have detected and stopped the perpetrator instead passed him along, gave him new opportunities, and allowed him to continue his killing in new settings with new patients who had no way of knowing the danger that walked among them, in the form of a quiet, unremarkable man in nursing scrubs. And Charles Cullen is perhaps the most devastating example of this phenomenon in the entire history of American healthcare, a man who worked as a nurse in hospitals and medical facilities across New Jersey and Pennsylvania for 16 years, who killed patients in at least 9 different institutions during that time, who was investigated, questioned, and flagged on multiple occasions without ever being arrested or prevented from continuing his work, who resigned from one position after another under clouds of suspicion only to be hired somewhere else without meaningful background checks or interinstitutional communication, and who ultimately confessed to killing approximately 40 patients, though investigators and researchers who have studied his case believe the true number may be significantly higher, potentially reaching into the hundreds, making Charles Cullen not merely a serial killer, but quite possibly the most prolific serial killer in American history, a man whose crimes were enabled at every turn by a healthcare system that prioritized institutional reputation over patient safety, that failed to share critical information between employers, and that allowed a deeply troubled and demonstrably dangerous individual to maintain access to vulnerable patients long after there was ample reason to remove him from that access permanently. Charles Edmund Cullen was born on February 22, 1960, in West Orange, New Jersey, the youngest of 8 children, and his early life was marked by trauma and instability in ways that, when examined in retrospect, provide some context for profound psychological disturbance that would define his adult life, though context is emphatically not the same as justification, and the suffering of his childhood, real as it was, does not begin to account for the suffering he inflicted on the patients who trusted him with their lives. His father died when Cullen was just 7 months old, and his mother died in a car accident when he was 17. And in the years between those losses, he grew up in circumstances of financial hardship and emotional deprivation that left him isolated, socially awkward, and deeply unhappy. And his adolescence and young adulthood were marked by multiple suicide attempts, psychiatric hospitalizations, and a persistent inability to form stable relationships or find a sense of purpose or belonging in the world outside of his own troubled interior landscape. Cullen joined the United States Navy in 1978 and served for several years, during which time he worked in a submarine and developed a reputation as someone who was competent at technical tasks but deeply strange in his personal interactions. And there were incidents during his naval service that suggested his psychological instability was already manifesting in alarming ways, including an incident in which he was found wearing a surgical mask and gown and carrying medications in a part of the submarine where he had no business being. An incident that was investigated but not fully resolved before Cullen left the Navy under circumstances that were less than honorable, but that did not result in any formal criminal charges or any notation that would have flagged him to future employers. After leaving the Navy, Cullen trained as a nurse and entered the healthcare workforce in New Jersey in 1987, beginning his career at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, and it was here, in his very first nursing position, that he began killing, though this would not be established with certainty until years later when he confessed. And the first confirmed murder attributed to him from this period is that of a patient who received a fatal overdose of medication under circumstances that were suspicious but that were not at the time connected to Cullen specifically, and he remained at St. Barnabas for several years before leaving under circumstances that included an investigation into his conduct, an investigation that did not result in criminal charges, but that represented the first of many occasions on which institutions would identify Cullen as a problem employee, investigate him, and then fail to take action sufficient to prevent him from moving on and continuing to kill. Elsewhere, the pattern that would define Cullen's 16-year career as a healthcare serial killer was established early and repeated with remarkable consistency across multiple institutions and 2 states, a pattern in which he would be hired, begin killing patients through the administration of unauthorized medications, come under suspicion, be investigated by the institution, resign, or be pushed out, and then be hired by another institution that either did not check his references thoroughly enough to uncover the previous investigation or did check and received responses that were carefully worded to avoid legal liability, rather than honestly communicating concerns that the previous employer had about Cullen's conduct. This pattern reflects a fundamental failure in the healthcare hiring system that extended far beyond any single institution, a systemic reluctance to share information about problematic employees out of fear of defamation lawsuits, a culture in which hospitals and medical facilities protected their own reputations by handling concerns internally rather than reporting them to licensing boards or law enforcement, and a regulatory environment that did not require meaningful communication between healthcare employers about the reasons for an employee's departure. Cullen worked at War Hospital in Phillipsburg, New Jersey, at Hunterdon Medical Center in Flemington, New Jersey, at Morris View Nursing Home in Morris Township, New Jersey, at St. Barnabas twice, at the Middlesex County Burn Center, at Liberty Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Allentown, Pennsylvania, at Easton Hospital in Easton, Pennsylvania, at Lehigh Valley Hospital in Salisbury Township, Pennsylvania, and finally at Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, New Jersey, and at each of these institutions he killed patients. And at each of these institutions there were incidents, investigations, or concerns that should have ended his career, but that instead resulted only in his departure and relocation to a new facility where the cycle began again. The methods Cullen used to kill his patients were consistent across his career and reflected his knowledge as a nurse of the medications available in hospital settings and their effects on the human body, and he primarily used 2 methods: the administration of lethal overdoses of digoxin, a cardiac medication that in excessive doses causes fatal heart arrhythmias, and the administration of insulin to patients who were not diabetic, which drives blood sugar to dangerously low levels and causes hypoglycemic crises that can be fatal. And in both cases, the medications were ones that Cullen could access through the hospital's automated medication dispensing systems, and he exploited weaknesses and gaps in the oversight of these systems to obtain drugs for patients who had not been prescribed them, withdrawing medication from dispensers under false pretenses or accessing medications intended for other patients, and administering them in ways that would cause death while appearing in the medical record as natural deterioration. When investigators and forensic accountants later reviewed the records of the automated medication dispensing systems at the various institutions where Cullen had worked, they found thousands of instances of unusual medication withdrawals, many of them corresponding to the deaths of patients on Cullen's shifts. And this data, combined with his eventual confession, provided a comprehensive picture of the scale and methodology of his crimes that was simultaneously invaluable for establishing the truth and deeply disturbing for what it revealed about how long this pattern had been visible in the data without triggering meaningful action. The investigation that ultimately led to Cullen's arrest began at Somerset Medical Center in 2003, when hospital officials became concerned about the death of a patient named Reverend Florian Gall, who had died under suspicious circumstances, and about other unusual deaths on Cullen's unit, and they contacted the Somerset County Prosecutor's Office, and investigators began examining Cullen's background and the circumstances of patient deaths at the facility, and what they found was sufficiently alarming to warrant a focused investigation that would bring together law enforcement from multiple jurisdictions and eventually result in his arrest. Two nurses at Somerset Medical Center, Amy Luffren and Danny Baldwin, played crucial roles in the investigation, with Luffren in particular developing a close relationship with Cullen as part of the investigative effort, a relationship that required extraordinary personal courage and that was later depicted in the book and film adaptation known as The Good Nurse. And it was in part through this relationship and the information it generated that investigators were able to build a case against Cullen sufficient to support his arrest. Charles Cullen was arrested on December 12, 2003, outside his home in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and taken into custody by New Jersey and Pennsylvania law enforcement. And in the immediate aftermath of his arrest, he agreed to cooperate with investigators, and the cooperation he provided over the following weeks and months was extensive and detailed, as he confessed to killing patients at multiple institutions across his career, and provided investigators with specific information about victims, methods, and circumstances that allowed law enforcement to reconstruct a significant portion of his criminal history, even for cases where the physical evidence had long since been lost or had never been recognized as evidence of a crime at the time. The confessions Cullen provided were extraordinary documents in the history of serial killer investigations, not because of any remorse or clarity they revealed on his part, because Cullen was notably detached and inconsistent in his explanations for why he had killed, sometimes describing his actions as a form of mercy killing for patients he believed were suffering, sometimes attributing them to impulse or opportunity, without any clear rationale, and sometimes expressing a kind of bewilderment at his own behavior that investigators found genuinely difficult to assess. But because of the sheer scope of the information they contained, the number of institutions named, the number of victims identified, and the systemic picture they painted of a healthcare system that had failed repeatedly and catastrophically to protect the people in its care. Cullen ultimately pleaded guilty to the murders of 13 patients in New Jersey and to the attempted murder of one additional patient, and he cooperated with Pennsylvania authorities as well, providing information about killings in that state, and in exchange for his cooperation, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty, a decision that was controversial among the families of his victims, but that was defended by prosecutors as necessary to obtain the full scope of his cooperation and to bring whatever measure of accountability was possible to a situation where many of the cases would otherwise have been impossible to prosecute successfully given the passage of time and the loss of evidence. Judge Paul Armstrong sentenced Charles Cullen in New Jersey in March of 2006 to 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, and he received additional consecutive life sentences in Pennsylvania, ensuring that he would spend the remainder of his life in prison. And Cullen is currently incarcerated at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, where he has remained since his sentencing, having no prospect of release and having become in the years since his conviction a reference point in academic, regulatory, and policy discussions about healthcare worker oversight, medication dispensing security, and the information-sharing obligations of healthcare employers. The legislative response to the Cullen case included the passage of laws in New Jersey and other states requiring healthcare institutions to report concerns about employee conduct to licensing boards and provide honest references rather than neutral or evasive ones. And there were significant changes to the oversight of automated medication dispensing systems in hospitals across the country, changes designed to close the gaps that Cullen had exploited and to ensure that unusual patterns of medication withdrawal would be flagged and investigated rather than going unnoticed in the background noise of a busy medical facility. For the families of the patients Cullen killed, the resolution of the case through guilty pleas rather than trials meant that they were spared the ordeal of extended courtroom proceedings, but also denied the fuller public accounting that a trial might have provided And many of them have spoken publicly over the years about the ongoing difficulty of knowing that their loved ones died not from their illnesses, but from the deliberate actions of a man who was supposed to be helping them and about. The additional layer of pain that comes from knowing that multiple institutions identified Cullen as a problem and passed him along rather than stopping him. A betrayal not just by one individual, but by an entire system that was supposed to be trustworthy and that failed in the most fundamental way possible, with consequences measured not in abstractions, but in the lives of real people who deserve protection, and receive instead the most profound violation of the trust they had placed in the hands of their caregivers. Number 6, Niels Hogel, the German nurse who killed over 80 patients and became Europe's deadliest post-war serial killer. There are moments in the history of criminal justice when the full scale of a perpetrator's crimes only becomes apparent years, sometimes decades, after the killing is stopped, when investigators working backward through records and exhumations and the painstaking reconstruction of institutional failures gradually uncover a truth so vast and so terrible that it reframes everything that was previously understood about a person, a place, and a system. And the story of Niels Hogel is one of the most staggering examples of this phenomenon in modern European history. A case that began with the arrest of a German intensive care nurse for a single suspicious patient death in 2005, and that expanded over the following 15 years into the largest serial murder investigation in the history of post-war Germany, ultimately establishing that Hogel had deliberately killed at least 85 patients across 2 hospitals in northwestern Germany over a period of 5 years, with investigators and prosecutors believing the true number of his victims was likely higher still, potentially exceeding 100, making him not merely a criminal but catastrophe, a human disaster of a scale that forced Germany to confront profound questions about the oversight of its healthcare institutions, the complicity of administrators who had suspected something was wrong and had chosen institutional reputation over patient safety, and the systemic vulnerabilities that had allowed a single deeply disturbed individual to prey on the most vulnerable people in his care for years without being stopped. Niels Hogel was born on December 30th, 1976, in Wilhelmshaven, a port city in Lower Saxony in northwestern Germany, and he grew up in what appeared to be an ordinary middle-class family, attending school without particular distinction, developing no obvious behavioral signs that would have marked him out to those around him as someone capable of the crimes he would later commit, and pursuing a career in nursing that seemed on its surface to reflect a genuine interest in healthcare and in working with patients, though the reality of his relationship with the medical environment and with the patients in his care was something entirely different from what his professional persona suggested. Hogel completed his nursing training and began working as an intensive care nurse in the late 1990s, and he joined the staff of the Klinikum Oldenburg, a large hospital in the city of Oldenburg in Lower Saxony, in 1999, and it was here that he began his killing, though the full extent of what he was doing at Oldenburg would not be established until years after he had left the institution and moved on to his next position. The method Hogel used to kill his patients was consistent throughout his criminal career and reflected both his nursing knowledge and his access to the medications available in intensive care settings, and he primarily killed by deliberately inducing cardiac arrest in patients through the unauthorized administration of cardiovascular medications, in particular drugs such as adrenaline, lidocaine, and sotalol, which are used in controlled settings to treat cardiac arrhythmias, but which in excessive or inappropriately administered doses can cause the heart to stop beating, and Hogel would inject these drugs into patients who had not been prescribed them, creating a medical emergency, and then attempt to resuscitate the patient, positioning himself as a skilled and decisive nurse who stepped up in a crisis, who remained calm while others panicked, who possessed the technical ability to bring someone back from the edge of death. And this pattern of behavior, this manufactured heroism, is recognizable as a variant of the same psychological dynamic that drove Richard Angelo in New York, a desperate need for recognition and validation that found its outlet in the creation of the very crises the perpetrator then attempted to resolve. At Klinikum Oldenburg, colleagues began to notice that an unusual number of resuscitation emergencies were occurring on Hogel's shifts, that patients who had been stable would suddenly deteriorate when he was on duty, and that Hogel himself was often present and eager to participate in resuscitation efforts in a way that some colleagues found notable. And there were internal discussions about these patterns, concerns that were raised informally among staff members who could not quite articulate what they suspected, but who felt that something was wrong. And yet the formal institutional response to these concerns was inadequate, driven by a reluctance to make accusations against a colleague without definitive proof, and by the institutional inertia that tends to resist acknowledging the possibility that someone within the system is causing deliberate harm. The situation at Clinicum Oldenburg eventually became untenable, and in 2002 Hogel left the hospital and joined the staff of the Clinicum Delmenhorst, a smaller hospital in the nearby town of Delmenhorst. And what is both infuriating and heartbreaking about this transition is that administrators at Clinicum Oldenburg were aware of concerns about Hogel's conduct, aware that his departure was connected to suspicions about the unusual mortality rate on his shifts, and yet they provided him with a reference that allowed him to obtain employment at Delmenhorst without the new institution having any meaningful understanding of the concerns that had surrounded his work at Oldenburg. And this failure of communication between institutions is one of the central institutional failures of the entire case, a failure that directly enabled the continuation of Hogel's killing in a new setting with a new set of victims. At Clinicum Delmenhorst, the pattern continued and in some respects intensified, with Hogel killing patients at a rate that would eventually be established as even higher than at Oldenburg, and the same dynamic repeated itself, with colleagues noticing the unusual frequency of emergencies on his shifts, with informal concerns being raised and not adequately acted upon, with an institutional culture that prioritized its own reputation, and the avoidance of scandal over the safety of the patients in its care. And this continued until 2005, when Hogel was caught in the act of injecting a patient with medication the patient had not been prescribed, and was arrested by police who had been called to the hospital following a report of a suspicious incident. Hogel was initially charged and prosecuted for the attempted murder of the patient he had been caught injecting, and in 2006 he was convicted of that offense and sentenced to 7.5 years in prison, a sentence that reflected the single case that had been established at that point, and that was in retrospect almost incomprehensibly inadequate given the scale of what investigators would subsequently uncover, but which represented the limit of what could be proven at that stage of the investigation given the absence of a systematic review of deaths at the institutions where Hogel had worked. It was during his imprisonment for the initial conviction that investigators began to examine the broader pattern of deaths at Clinicum Delmenhorst and Clinicum Oldenburg, and what they found as they reviewed records and began the process of exhuming bodies and conducting toxicological testing was deeply alarming, a pattern of deaths on Hogel's shifts that was statistically impossible to attribute to chance, with the mortality rate in units where he worked dramatically exceeding what would be expected given the patient population. And as exhumations proceeded and toxicological results came back, it became increasingly clear that the scale of Hogel's killing was far greater than the single case for which he had been convicted. In 2014, Hogel was charged with additional murders and stood trial, and in 2015 he was convicted of 2 murders and 2 attempted murders and received an additional sentence. But even this second conviction still dramatically understated the true scope of his crimes, and investigators continued their work, exhuming more bodies, conducting more toxicological testing, and building toward a comprehensive prosecution that would attempt to hold Hogel accountable for the full extent of what he had done. The investigation that led to the definitive reckoning with Hogel's crimes was one of the largest forensic investigations in German legal history, involving the exhumation of approximately 130 bodies, the collection and analysis of thousands of pieces of evidence, the interviewing of hundreds of witnesses, including former colleagues, patients' family members, and medical experts, and the review of institutional records spanning years of hospital operations at 2 different facilities, and the scale of this effort reflected both the gravity of the crimes being investigated and the determination of German prosecutors and investigators to establish the truth as completely as possible and to bring to justice not only Hogel himself, but also those whose institutional failures and deliberate choices had enabled his killing to continue. In 2018, Hogel was charged with 97 counts of murder, a number that represented the cases where investigators had been able to establish sufficient evidence to support a prosecution, and his trial began in October 2018 at the Oldenburg Regional Court and lasted for months, during which time prosecutors presented the evidence accumulated through years of investigation. Forensic experts testified about the toxicological findings from exhumed remains. Former colleagues described the patterns they had observed and the concerns they had raised, and family members of victims sat in the courtroom and confronted the man who had killed their loved ones while wearing the uniform of a caregiver. Hogel himself, in the course of the trial, admitted to killing patients at both hospitals, providing detailed accounts of specific cases and expressing what he described as remorse, though the sincerity of that remorse was questioned by many observers and by the families of his victims, who found it impossible to reconcile the language of regret with the deliberateness and the duration of what he had done. And in June of 2019, the court found Niels Hogel guilty of 85 counts of murder and sentenced him to life imprisonment, the maximum sentence available under German law, with a subsequent determination that he should be classified as a particularly serious case, making his eventual release even more unlikely than a life sentence alone would have ensured. The trial of Hogel was followed by a separate set of proceedings targeting the administrators and colleagues at Klinikum Delmenhorst, who had been aware of concerns about his conduct and had failed to act appropriately. And in 2021, a trial began in which several former hospital administrators and a colleague faced charges related to their handling of the concerns about Hogel, reflecting the German legal system's determination to hold accountable not only the perpetrator himself, but also those whose institutional failures had contributed to the death toll, though the outcomes of these proceedings were less definitive than many observers and victims' families had hoped, with some defendants acquitted and others receiving relatively modest penalties that did not fully satisfy the demand for accountability that the scale of the tragedy warranted. For the families of the 85 confirmed victims, and for the families of the additional patients whose deaths are suspected to have been caused by Hogel, but for whom sufficient forensic evidence could not be assembled to support charges, the conclusion of the legal proceedings brought a measure of justice, but could not undo the fundamental reality that their loved ones had been killed by someone they trusted in institutions that had been warned and had not acted, and that the systems designed to protect patients in their most vulnerable moments had failed comprehensively and repeatedly. And the legacy of the Niels Hogel case in Germany is a profound and ongoing reckoning with the obligations of healthcare institutions, with the responsibilities of colleagues who observe concerning behavior, and with the question of what it truly means to prioritize patient safety over institutional reputation, when those two imperatives come into conflict in ways that demand courage, transparency, and an uncompromising commitment to the welfare of the people who place their lives in the hands of those who care for them. Number 7. Janine Jones, the Texas nurse who injected children with a deadly drug and walked free to kill again. There are stories within the history of criminal justice that carry within them not one failure, but many, not one moment of institutional negligence, but a cascading sequence of decisions made by people in positions of responsibility who chose the wrong path at every critical juncture, who prioritized their own comfort, their institution's reputation, and the avoidance of scandal over the safety of the children in their care. And the story of Janine Jones is one of the most enraging of these. Stories, a tale of a pediatric nurse in Texas who killed children by injecting them with a muscle-paralyzing drug, who was investigated and suspected by colleagues and administrators at a major San Antonio hospital, whose victims included infants and toddlers who had been brought to medical facilities by parents desperate for help, and who was not arrested, not charged, not publicly exposed, but instead quietly allowed to leave her position at that hospital and move on to a new job in a different city where she continued to endanger children before finally being caught. A sequence of events driven not by any shortage of suspicion or evidence, but by a deliberate institutional decision to protect the hospital from scandal at the cost of the children who would subsequently be placed in Jones's care. Janine Jones was born on July 13, 1950, in San Antonio, Texas, and was adopted as an infant, and her early life and development were marked by instability and loss in ways that her later defenders would point to as context for her psychological difficulties. Though, as with every case in this series, personal history provides context, but not justification for the deliberate killing of children. Jones worked various jobs before entering the healthcare field, and eventually trained as a licensed vocational nurse, a credential that gave her access to patients in medical settings but represented a lower level of formal training than a registered nurse. And she joined the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit at Medical Center Hospital in San Antonio in the late 1970s. And it was here, in one of the most demanding and emotionally intense settings in all of medicine, a unit where critically ill children fought for their lives and where nurses worked under enormous pressure and stress, that Jones found what she would later describe as her calling, a sense of purpose and identity that she had not found anywhere else, and she threw herself into work with an intensity that colleagues initially found impressive, demonstrating what appeared to be genuine emotional investment in the children on the unit, and a willingness to take on difficult cases and demanding shifts. The darker reality of Jones's presence on the pediatric intensive care unit at Medical Center Hospital began to emerge through a pattern that was by now familiar from other cases in the series: an unusual frequency of medical emergencies and deaths on her shifts, a statistical anomaly that was noticed by colleagues and eventually by administrators, and that generated internal concern long before any formal investigation or any action that might have protected the children who continued to be placed in her care. Colleagues described Jones as someone who became almost emotionally elevated during resuscitation emergencies, who seemed to come alive in the chaos of a crisis in a way that struck some of them as inappropriate, who sought out these moments of high drama and intense medical intervention with an eagerness that went beyond professional dedication into something more troubling. And the pattern of deaths and near deaths on her shifts became a source of discussion and unease within the unit that eventually reached the attention of hospital administrators. The internal investigation conducted by Medical Center Hospital into the deaths on Jones's unit was a deeply troubled process, hampered by institutional resistance, by the difficulty of proving that specific deaths were caused by deliberate action rather than the natural deterioration of critically ill children, and by a pervasive reluctance to confront the full implications of what the evidence was suggesting. And the conclusion of that investigation, which found that the elevated death rate on Jones's shifts was suspicious and that Jones herself was the most likely explanation for that pattern, did not result in her arrest, did not result in her being reported to law enforcement or to the state nursing board, and did not result in any public disclosure that would have warned other employers about the danger she represented. Instead, the hospital made a decision that has been described by critics, investigators, and legal commentators as one of the most catastrophic institutional failures in the history of American pediatric medicine, offering Jones what amounted to an informal arrangement under which she would leave her position at Medical Center Hospital without a formal termination, without a public accounting of the reasons for her departure, and without any action that would prevent her from working as a nurse elsewhere. And this decision was driven by a calculation that a formal accusation against Jones would expose the hospital to enormous legal liability for the deaths that had already occurred on its watch, and that the safest path for the institution, though emphatically not for the public, was to quietly manage her departure and hope that the problem would resolve itself. Jones left Medical Center Hospital in 1982 and was subsequently hired as a nurse by a pediatrician named Kathleen Holland, who had recently opened a clinic in Kerrville, Texas, a small city in the Texas Hill Country, and who hired Jones in part because of her experience in pediatric intensive care, not knowing and not being told about the cloud of suspicion that surrounded her departure from San Antonio. And it was at Holland's clinic that Jones committed the crimes for which she would eventually be convicted, injecting children brought to the clinic with succinylcholine, a powerful muscle relaxant used in surgical settings to temporarily paralyze muscles, and that when administered outside a controlled setting causes a recipient to become unable to breathe, inducing a respiratory crisis that mimics a sudden medical emergency, and that without immediate intervention can cause death from oxygen deprivation. The children who were brought to Kathleen Holland's clinic were ordinary patients, children brought in by parents for routine visits or for the treatment of minor illnesses, children who had no reason to be in life-threatening danger and whose sudden catastrophic deterioration in the clinic setting was initially attributed to hidden medical conditions that had not yet been diagnosed, and it was a frequency and pattern of these emergencies, all of them occurring when Jones was on duty, all of them involving children who had been stable moments before Jones interacted with them, that began to alarm Kathleen Holland, and eventually led her to confront the possibility that something was terribly wrong. The case that brought Jones's crimes to the attention of law enforcement involved a 15-month-old girl named Chelsea McClellan, who was brought to Holland's clinic in September of 1982 by her parents Petty and Reed McClellan, and Chelsea suffered what appeared to be a series of seizures at the clinic, was treated by Jones, recovered temporarily, and then suffered another crisis during a subsequent visit that proved fatal, and the death of Chelsea McClellan, combined with a pattern of other emergencies at the clinic, prompted Kathleen Holland to raise concerns with the local district attorney's office, and the investigation that followed would eventually lead to Jones's arrest and prosecution. Texas Ranger Joe Davis led the investigation into the deaths and near deaths at Holland's clinic, and the forensic challenge facing investigators was significant because succinylcholine breaks down rapidly in the body after death and is extremely difficult to detect through standard toxicological testing. And investigators needed to establish not only that the drug had been administered, but that Jones was the one who had administered it. And the investigation involved the exhumation of Chelsea McClellan's body, sophisticated toxicological testing that was at the forefront of forensic science at the time, and the painstaking reconstruction of events at the clinic through witness interviews, medication records, and the testimony of Kathleen Holland herself, who cooperated fully with investigators once she had confronted the reality of what had been happening in her clinic. The toxicological testing of Chelsea McClellan's exhumed remains detected the breakdown products of succinylcholine at levels consistent with a lethal dose having been administered, and this finding, combined with a witness testimony about Jones's behavior and access to the child, provided the foundation for the prosecution's case. And Jones was arrested in 1982 and charged with murder in connection with Chelsea McClellan's death. An investigation also uncovered evidence relating to other children who had been endangered at Holland's clinic, leading to additional charges of injury to a child. The trial of Janine Jones and the death of Chelsea McClellan took place in January and February of 1984 in Georgetown, Texas, having been moved from Kerr County on a change of venue motion, and it was an emotionally devastating proceeding in which Petty McClellan testified about the death of her daughter, in which medical experts debated the significance of the toxicological findings, and in which the prosecution built a case that portrayed Jones as a nurse who had deliberately endangered children to satisfy a psychological need for drama and heroism that could only be met in the context of a medical emergency. The jury found Janine Jones guilty of murder in the death of Chelsea McClellan, and Judge Glenn Harmon sentenced her to 99 years in prison. And in a subsequent trial, she was convicted of injury to a child in connection with the injection of another patient and received an additional concurrent sentence of 60 years. And these sentences meant that Jones was facing a total of 159 years in prison, a sentence that seemed to ensure she would never be released and would never again have access to vulnerable children. However, in one of the most disturbing postscripts in the history of American criminal justice, a Texas law enacted in the 1970s that was designed to reduce prison overcrowding provided that inmates convicted of certain offenses were entitled to mandatory release after serving one-third of their sentence. And this law applied to Jones's conviction, meaning that despite the severity of her crimes and the length of her sentence, she became eligible for release, and she was in fact released from prison in 2018 when she had served the required portion of her term, a release that caused enormous distress among the families of her victims and widespread public outrage, and that prompted urgent calls for legislative action to prevent the mandatory release provisions from applying to cases of this kind. The release of Janine Jones in 2018 was not the end of the legal proceedings against her. However, because Texas prosecutors, anticipating her release and determined to ensure she would not walk free, had been working for years to bring new charges against her for additional killings that had not been prosecuted during her original trials. And in 2017, before her scheduled release, Jones was indicted on new murder charges relating to the deaths of additional children at Medical Center Hospital in San Antonio. Cases that had been reopened and reinvestigated with the benefit of forensic techniques that had not been available in the early 1980s. Jones initially challenged these new charges on double jeopardy grounds, arguing that she could not be tried again for crimes related to her original prosecution. But the courts determined that the new charges related to distinct criminal acts and were not barred by double jeopardy. And after years of legal proceedings, Jones ultimately pleaded guilty in 2020 to the murders of two additional children, Crystal Tyson and Joshua Sawyer, receiving additional sentences that ensured she would remain in prison for the rest of her life. The legacy of the Janine Jones case is therefore a complex and deeply troubling one, involving not only the crimes of a single individual, but the institutional failures of Medical Center Hospital in San Antonio, whose administrators made a conscious decision to protect their institution rather than protect the public, a decision that directly resulted in additional children being placed in Jones's care and endangered by her. And the question of accountability for that institutional decision was never fully resolved in a way that many observers and victims' families believed. It should have been, with no criminal charges ever being brought against the administrators who chose reputation over safety and whose choice had such devastating consequences. For the families of the children Jones killed and injured, the decades-long legal saga has been an exhausting and re-traumatizing ordeal, a repeated return to the most painful chapter of their lives driven by the failures of a system that should have stopped Jones long before it did, and that instead allowed her access to children in multiple settings across multiple years. And the children who died, Chelsea McClellan, and the others whose lives Jones ended in the wards and clinics of Texas, deserve to be remembered not as statistics in a story about institutional failure, but as individual human beings, each one precious, each one robbed of everything they might have become by someone who was supposed to keep them safe and who instead made them targets of her own psychological dysfunction and her own inexcusable cruelty. Number 8. Amy Archer Gilligan, the original angel of death who poisoned elderly residents and inspired a dark comedy that hid a darker truth. There are cases in the history of American crime that are so old, so deeply embedded in the early fabric of the nation's legal and social history, that they have acquired over time a patina of distance, a sense that they belong to a different era with different standards and different sensibilities. And yet, when examined closely, these cases reveal themselves to be not relics of a bygone age, but blueprints for crimes that would follow them, templates for the exploitation of vulnerability and trust that will be repeated again and again in the decades and centuries to come. And the case of Amy Archer Gilligan is precisely this kind of foundational story, a case that unfolded in the small towns of Connecticut in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, that involved the systematic poisoning of elderly and infirm residents of a private care home by the woman who ran it. That prompted one of the earliest major forensic investigations in American legal history. And that was so disturbing in its details and so sensational in its public impact that it inspired a celebrated Broadway play and later a Hollywood film, a transformation from documented horror into comedic fiction that, while understandable as a product of its cultural moment, had the effect of softening and distancing the real human tragedy at the heart of the story and obscuring the fact that behind the theatrical premise of arsenic and old lace lay the genuine suffering and death of real people who deserved better than to have their murders become the inspiration for entertainment. Amy Duggan was born in 1868 in Litchfield County, Connecticut, and grew up in circumstances that were modest but not impoverished, and she developed from an early age what those who knew her described as a particular gift for presenting herself as warm, caring, and deeply invested in the welfare of others, a social facility that would serve her extraordinarily well in the business she eventually entered, and that would for years prevent those around her from recognizing the predatory reality beneath the nurturing surface. Amy married a man named John Archer in the late 19th century, and together they opened the Sister Amy Nursing Home for the Elderly in Windsor, Connecticut, in 1907, offering to provide care for elderly and infirm individuals who could no longer manage independently and whose families were looking for a safe and compassionate environment in which their loved ones could live out their final years. And the home was initially regarded by the community as a genuine service, a place where vulnerable people could receive the attention and care they needed, and Amy Archer herself was seen as a dedicated and compassionate proprietor whose commitment to her residents was evident in her attentiveness and her apparent emotional investment in their welfare. The business model of the Sister Amy Nursing Home was structured around 2 types of arrangements with residents and their families, either a weekly fee paid for ongoing care, or a lump sum payment made up front in exchange for a lifetime care guarantee, meaning that the resident would pay a single large sum and be assured of care for the remainder of their life regardless of how long they lived. And it was the second arrangement that created the financial incentive that investigators would later identify as the engine driving the murders, because under the lifetime care model, the death of a resident represented a financial benefit to the home, removing an ongoing obligation and allowing the lump sum already paid to be retained in full without any further expenditure on the resident's care. And Amy Archer Gilligan, who was by all accounts attentive to the financial dimensions of her operation, with an interest that went well beyond what ordinary business management would require, understood this dynamic perfectly and exploited it with a cold and systematic efficiency that was entirely invisible beneath her warm and solicitous exterior. John Archer died in 1910, and Amy subsequently married a man named Michael Gilligan in 1913, adding his surname to hers, and Michael Gilligan himself died just 3 months after the wedding, a death that would later attract significant retrospective suspicion, but that at the time was recorded as natural and that prompted sympathy rather than scrutiny from those who knew Amy, who appeared to community as a woman twice bereaved, a devoted caregiver now carrying the burden of her work alone. And this image of patient, self-sacrificing widowhood was central to persona that protected her from suspicion for so many years. The deaths at the Sister Amy nursing home began to attract attention not from law enforcement or medical authorities, but from the families of residents who started to notice what seemed like an unusually high mortality rate among the people they had entrusted to Amy's care. And these families began to talk to one another and to local journalists, and it was a reporter named Clifton Sherman at the Hartford Courant who first began to systematically investigate the pattern of deaths at the home, publishing articles in 1914 that raised questions about the frequency of deaths at the facility and that prompted the authorities to take a closer look at what had been happening there. The investigation that followed Sherman's reporting was one of the most significant forensic investigations in the history of early 20th century American law enforcement, requiring the exhumation of bodies from local cemeteries and the application of toxicological testing techniques that were at the cutting edge of what was available at the time. And the results of these examinations were shocking, revealing the presence of arsenic and strychnine in multiple exhumed bodies, poisons that had no legitimate medical explanation and that were entirely consistent with deliberate administration rather than any natural process of disease or decay. Arsenic was at the time relatively easy to obtain, available over the counter in many pharmacies and general stores as a component of various household products and medicines, and Amy Archer Gilligan had purchased arsenic on multiple occasions from local suppliers, purchases that were documented and that investigators were able to trace, and the combination of documented poison purchases, toxicological findings, and exhumed remains, and the statistical pattern of deaths at the home under her care built a case that was formidable even by the standards of a later and more forensically sophisticated era. Amy Archer Gilligan was arrested in 1916 and charged with the murders of 5 residents of her care home, with the prosecution selecting these 5 cases as the most clearly supported by the available evidence from among a larger number of suspicious deaths that investigators believed she had been responsible for. An indictment represented not only a criminal charge against a specific individual, but an indictment of the entire system of private care for the elderly that existed at the time, a system with almost no regulatory oversight, no inspection regime, no mechanism for detecting abuse or exploitation, and no meaningful protection for the vulnerable people who place themselves in the hands of private operators whose financial interests were in some cases directly aligned with the deaths of the residents in their care. The trial of Amy Archer Gilligan on a single count of first-degree murder, the prosecution having elected to try her first for the murder of a resident named Franklin Andrews, took place in 1917 and was a major public event, drawing widespread press coverage and public attention not only in Connecticut but across the country. And the testimony presented included the forensic evidence from the exhumations, evidence of Amy's arsenic purchases, testimony from former employees and neighbors who described patterns of behavior at the home that were consistent with the prosecution's theory of the case, and medical expert testimony about the effects of arsenic poisoning and the way in which an arsenic death could be made to resemble the natural deterioration of an already ill person. Amy Archer Gilligan's defense argued that the deaths at her home were natural, that elderly and infirm people in a care setting inevitably died at higher rates than the general population, and that the arsenic found in exhumed remains could be explained by contamination from the soil or by legitimate medicinal use, arsenic having been at the time a component of certain patent medicines. But the jury was not persuaded by these arguments, and after deliberating they found Amy Archer Gilligan guilty of first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to death, making her at that moment one of the few women in Connecticut history to be condemned to execution. However, the death sentence was not carried out, because on appeal the Connecticut Supreme Court ordered a new trial, finding procedural errors in the original proceedings, and in the retrial Amy Archer Gilligan pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of second-degree murder, receiving a sentence of life imprisonment rather than death, and she was committed to the Connecticut State Prison for Women, where she served her sentence. And she was subsequently transferred to a state hospital for the mentally ill after being diagnosed with a psychiatric condition, and she died in 1962 at the age of approximately 92, having spent nearly 5 decades in state custody. The transformation of Amy Archigilligan's crimes into theatrical property that became Arsenic and Old Lace began with a 1939 play by Joseph Kessering, which took the premise of elderly women poisoning their house guests for ostensibly merciful reasons and played it entirely for comedic effect. And the play was a massive commercial success, running for nearly 1,500 performances on Broadway, and it was subsequently adapted into a celebrated 1944 film directed by Frank Capra and starring Cary Grant, a film that is still widely regarded as a classic of American comedy. And there is a deep and troubling irony in the fact that the real events on which this cultural phenomenon was distantly based involved not the gentle eccentrics of the theatrical version, but a calculating and predatory woman who poisoned elderly people for financial gain, whose victims were not lonely bachelors who might arguably have welcomed a swift end, but people who had paid for care and protection and received instead deliberate murder, and whose families had trusted someone with their most vulnerable loved ones and had been rewarded for that trust with grief and loss. The regulatory legacy of the Archigilligan case in Connecticut and more broadly in the United States was significant, contributing to the development of oversight mechanisms for private care facilities that had previously operated in a near-total regulatory vacuum, and prompting legislative action to establish minimum standards for the operation of homes for the elderly and infirm, requirements for record-keeping and medical oversight that represented a recognition that the vulnerability of the population served by these facilities demanded a level of scrutiny and accountability that the market alone could never provide. For the families of the residents who died at the Sister Amy nursing home, the resolution of the case through Amy's eventual guilty plea and lifetime imprisonment provided a formal acknowledgement that their loved ones had been murdered and that the person responsible had been held accountable. But the decades that elapsed between the crimes and the final resolution of the legal proceedings, the reduction of charges from first to second-degree murder, and the subsequent cultural sanitization of the entire story into theatrical comedy represented a series of diminishments of the truth that the victims and their families deserved to have told in its full and unvarnished horror. The truth that Amy Archigilligan had looked at the people in her care, people who were elderly and vulnerable and trusting, and who had given her their money and their welfare in exchange for a promise of compassion, and had decided that their deaths were worth more to her than their lives, and had acted on that calculation with a coldness and methodical efficiency that stands as one of the most complete betrayals of the caregiver's responsibility in the long and disturbing history of those who prey upon the vulnerable. Number 9, Dana Sue Gray, the California caretaker who murdered elderly women to fund her shopping addiction. There are crimes that shock not only because of their brutality, but because of the motive behind them, because of the revelation that a human life was ended not out of passion or ideology or even the twisted psychological compulsions that drive some of the killers in the series, but out of something so mundane, so ordinary, so deeply embedded in the consumer culture of modern life that its appearance as the engine of murder creates a cognitive dissonance that is almost impossible to resolve. And the case of Dana Sue Gray is precisely this kind of crime, a story set in the sun-drenched communities of Southern California in the mid-1990s, involving a woman who had worked as a nurse, who had positioned herself within a social world that brought her into contact with elderly and vulnerable women, and who murdered at least 3 of those women, and attempted to murder a 4th in order to steal their money and use it to fund a compulsive shopping habit that it spiraled so far out of control that she was willing to kill to sustain it. A series of crimes that were brutal in their physical execution, intimate in the most disturbing sense, because they were committed against women who knew and trusted their attacker, and that were ultimately solved through a combination of forensic evidence, witness accounts, and the trail of credit card receipts that Dana Sue Gray left behind as she spent the money of her victims on clothing, home furnishings, and the other consumer goods that she apparently valued more highly than the lives she took to obtain them. Dana Sue Gray was born on December 6, 1957, in the Inland Empire region of Southern California, and she grew up in a family environment that was marked by instability, and she later described a childhood characterized by emotional difficulties and a complicated relationship with her mother, and these early experiences, while providing some psychological context for understanding the person she became, do not and cannot explain or excuse the specific crimes she committed as an adult, crimes that were deliberate, calculated, and deeply cruel in ways that no amount of personal history can justify. Gray trained and worked as a nurse for a period of her adult life, an occupation that gave her both a working knowledge of human vulnerability and physical fragility, and a social positioning that brought her into contact with elderly and infirm people in ways that would later provide her with access to victims. And she eventually left nursing and moved into other areas of work. But the knowledge and the social connections she had developed during her nursing career remained part of her world and contributed to the circumstances in which her crimes occurred. By the early 1990s, Dana Sue Gray was living in the Canyon Lake community in Riverside County, California, a gated community that projected an image of comfortable suburban safety, and she was by all outward appearances a reasonably ordinary member of that community, someone who socialized with neighbors, who was known to local businesses, and who maintained the surface presentation of a normal life. But beneath that surface, she was struggling with a compulsive shopping disorder that had created serious financial difficulties, a pattern of spending on clothing, housewares, and other consumer goods that far exceeded her means and that had accumulated debts she could not manage through legitimate income alone. And it was this financial desperation, combined with whatever psychological factors drove the compulsion itself, that created the conditions for murder. The first victim was Norma Davis, a 57-year-old woman who was a mother of Gray's former boyfriend, and who was found strangled and beaten to death in her home in Canyon Lake on February 28, 1994, and the circumstances of her death were immediately suspicious, with investigators noting signs of a violent struggle and evidence that items including her credit cards had been taken from the home. But the initial investigation did not immediately focus on Dana Sue Gray as a suspect, and in the hours and days following Norma Davis's murder, Gray used the stolen credit cards to go on a shopping spree, purchasing goods at multiple stores in the area and leaving behind a paper trail that would eventually become one of the most important pieces of evidence against her. The second victim was June Roberts, an 87-year-old woman who was described by those who knew her as a vibrant and independent elderly woman, and who was found strangled to death in her home in Sun City on March 10, 1994, just 10 days after the murder of Norma Davis. And again, the victim's credit cards and cash were missing. And again, Gray used the stolen financial instruments to fund immediate shopping purchases, demonstrating a recklessness and a compulsiveness that would ultimately contribute to her identification and arrest, as the credit card records created a detailed and damning timeline, connecting her to the victims in the immediate aftermath of their murders. The third victim was Dorinda Hawkins, an 81-year-old woman who was attacked in her home in Sun City on March 14, 1994, and who survived the attack, suffering serious injuries, including strangulation attempts and blunt force trauma. And her survival was enormously significant for the subsequent investigation, because she was able to provide investigators with description of her attacker and with details about the circumstances of the assault that helped to build the case against Gray. And the fact that she had survived when the other victims had not was a matter of chance and physical resilience rather than any mercy on the part of her attacker, who had left her for dead and who moved immediately after the assault to use Hawkins's credit cards for further shopping. The fourth victim was Etta Kathleen Meyer, a 76-year-old woman who was found strangled to death in her home in Canyon Lake on March 16, 1994, just 2 days after the attack on Dorinda Hawkins. And the murder of Etta Meyer represented the fourth violent crime in the space of less than 3 weeks. A concentrated burst of violence against elderly women in a relatively small geographic area that created enormous pressure on law enforcement to identify and apprehend the perpetrator before additional victims were targeted. The investigation into the murders and the attack on Dorinda Hawkins brought together detectives from the Riverside County Sheriff's Department and other local law enforcement agencies. And from an early stage, the pattern of the crimes pointed investigators towards certain conclusions about the nature of the perpetrator and the motivation for the attacks, because of consistent targeting of elderly women, the theft of credit cards and cash in each case, and the immediate use of those stolen financial instruments for retail purchases suggested a perpetrator motivated primarily by financial gain rather than by the more complex psychological drivers that characterize some other categories of violent crime. And the credit card record from the purchases made after each crime provided investigators with a geographical and temporal trail that could be matched against other evidence to identify the person responsible. Investigators reviewing the credit card records from purchases made with the cards stolen from victims found that many of the transactions had been made at stores in the area where Gray lived and where she was known as a regular customer, And when store employees were shown photographs and asked if they recognized the person who had made purchases with the stolen cards, some of them identified Gray, whose shopping habits had made her a familiar figure in local retail establishments. And this identification, combined with Gray's connection to Norma Davis through her relationship with Davis's son, and the geographical proximity of Gray's residence to crime scenes, made her a primary suspect and led investigators to focus their attention on her. Dana Sue Gray was arrested on March 17, 1994, just one day after the murder of Etta Meyer, and the speed of her arrest relative to the crimes reflected both the effectiveness of the credit card trail she had left and the intensity of the investigative effort that the series of murders had generated. And when investigators searched her home, they found evidence connecting her to the victims, including items that had been taken from the crime scenes, and the case against her began to build with momentum that made it clear this would be a prosecution with substantial evidentiary support. In the period following her arrest, Gray was evaluated by mental health professionals, and the assessments that resulted from these evaluations described a woman with a complex psychological profile in which compulsive behavior, emotional dysregulation, and a disordered relationship with material possessions played significant roles. And the question of whether and to what extent these psychological factors should be relevant to her criminal culpability became a central issue in the legal proceedings that followed, with the defense arguing that Gray's mental state was such that her responsibility for her actions was diminished, and the prosecution countering that whatever psychological difficulties Gray experienced did not negate the deliberateness and the physical brutality of her attacks on her victims. Dana Sue Gray was charged with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder, and in the proceedings that followed, she eventually reached a plea agreement with prosecutors, pleading guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of June Roberts and Etta Meyer, and accounts related to the attack on Dorinda Hawkins. And in exchange for her guilty pleas, she received a sentence of life in prison, without the possibility of parole, sparing her from the death penalty that prosecutors had indicated they would seek if the case went to trial, and the sentence ensured that she would remain in prison for the remainder of her life without any opportunity for release. The reaction of the families of Gray's victims to the plea agreement and the resulting sentence was mixed, with some feeling that the avoidance of trial and the removal of the death penalty from consideration represented an inadequate accounting for crimes that had been so brutal and so callously motivated, while others expressed relief that the legal proceedings had reached a resolution without the additional trauma of a lengthy trial, and the differing reactions of the victims' families reflected the impossible position in which the criminal justice system's processes place people who have suffered irreparable loss and who are seeking not merely legal resolution, but some form of meaningful justice that the law, by its nature, can only partially provide. The case of Dana Sue Gray raised significant questions about the intersection of mental health and criminal responsibility, about the nature of compulsive behavior and its relationship to deliberate violence, and about what it means for a society to grapple with crimes that are motivated not by the grand pathologies of the most sensationalized criminal cases, but by something as banal and as deeply embedded in contemporary culture as a compulsion to shop, to acquire, to possess, a motive that, in its very ordinariness, creates a particular kind of horror, because it suggests that the distance between ordinary consumer desire and the willingness to murder is not as vast as we might prefer to believe, and that the systems designed to protect vulnerable elderly people from those who might exploit or harm them need to be understood as operating not only against the obviously disturbed or the ideologically driven, but against the full range of human dysfunction and desperation that can, under the right circumstances, turn an ordinary person into someone capable of ending a life for the price of a credit card and the temporary satisfaction of a shopping trip. For Norma Davis, June Roberts, and Etta Meyer, the 3 women who died at Dana Sue Gray's hands, and for Dorinda Hawkins, who survived but who carried the trauma and the physical consequences of the assault against her for the rest of her life. The legacy of this case is a reminder that the elderly and the vulnerable are at risk, not only from the dramatic predators whose crimes make headlines, but from the quieter and more personal betrayals that occur when someone who is trusted, who has access, and who is in a position of proximity exploits that trust and that access in the service of their own needs, however mundane those needs might appear in comparison to the magnitude of the harm they cause. Number 10, Orville Lynn Majors. The Indiana nurse whose killing spree across a rural hospital changed the face of healthcare law in America. There are cases that serve as both a reckoning and a turning point. Cases whose resolution does not merely bring a perpetrator to justice, but forces a fundamental reassessment of the systems and structures that allowed the crimes to occur. Cases whose legacy extends far beyond the courtroom and into the legislative chambers and regulatory offices, where the rules governing protection of vulnerable people are written and rewritten in the hope that the lessons of tragedy will not be repeated. And the case of Orville Lynn Majors is precisely this kind of case, a story set in the small rural community of Vermilion County in western Indiana, involving a licensed practical nurse who worked in the intensive care unit of a small community hospital and who killed at least 6 patients due to injection of lethal doses of potassium chloride and epinephrine during a period of approximately 2 years in the mid-1990s, whose crimes were noticed by colleagues, flagged by investigators, and ultimately proven through one of the most ambitious and methodologically innovative forensic investigations in the history of Indiana law enforcement, and whose conviction and the legislative response it generated changed the legal landscape for healthcare worker oversight across the United States in ways that continue to shape policy and practice to this day. Orville Lynn Majors was born on November 17, 1961, in the small Indiana town of Clinton, and he grew up in the rural communities of Vermilion County, an area of western Indiana characterized by agricultural landscapes, tight-knit communities, and the particular social dynamics of small-town American life, where people know their neighbors, where reputations are built over generations, and where the institutions that serve the community, including its medical facilities, are understood as extensions of the community itself rather than as impersonal corporate entities. Majors pursued a career in healthcare and trained as a licensed practical nurse, a credential that gave him access to patients in medical settings and that reflected a level of training and competency sufficient to work in clinical environments. And he joined the staff of the Vermilion County Hospital in Clinton, Indiana, in 1993, working in the intensive care unit of this small rural facility, where he quickly established himself as a nurse who was willing to work difficult shifts and who appeared on the surface to be engaged with his work and his patients. The Vermilion County Hospital was a small institution serving a rural community, and like many such facilities, it operated with limited staffing resources and relied on the willingness of its employees to be flexible and committed, and Majors became a fixture of the intensive care unit, working frequently and becoming a familiar presence to both colleagues and to the families of patients who were admitted to the unit. And there was nothing in his initial presentation that would have immediately flagged him to those around him as dangerous, though the events that followed would cause those who had worked with him to re-examine everything they thought they had known about him. The pattern of deaths that would eventually lead to Majors' arrest and conviction began to emerge relatively quickly after he joined the intensive care unit staff, with colleagues noticing that the mortality rate on his shifts was significantly higher than on the shifts of other nurses, that patients who had been stable would deteriorate suddenly when Majors was on duty, and that the frequency of deaths during his working hours created a statistical pattern that was difficult to explain through natural variation alone. And these observations were not made in isolation, but were discussed among staff members and eventually brought to the attention of hospital administrators in ways that, while not immediately resulting in action, created a record concern that would later become significant in the investigation. The deaths attributed to Majors during his time at Vermilion County Hospital were concentrated in the period between 1993 and 1995, and the victims were patients admitted to the intensive care unit with a range of serious medical conditions, people who were already vulnerable but who were not necessarily expected to die imminently, and whose sudden deterioration and death on Majors' shifts represented a pattern that went beyond statistical probability and that investigators would later establish was a result of deliberate injections of potassium chloride and epinephrine. Drugs and the doses Majors administered would cause sudden cardiac arrest and death in ways that could easily be mistaken for natural deterioration in patients who were already seriously ill. Potassium chloride is a drug with legitimate medical uses, employed in carefully controlled doses and specific clinical contexts, but in excessive doses it disrupts the electrical activity of the heart and causes cardiac arrest. And its use as a murder weapon in medical settings is particularly insidious because elevated potassium levels in the blood can occur naturally in the process of cellular breakdown following death, making it extremely difficult in many cases to distinguish between a naturally elevated post-mortem potassium level and a potassium level elevated by deliberate injection prior to death, And this forensic challenge was one that investigators working on the Majors case would have to find innovative ways to overcome if they were to build a case sufficient to support prosecution. Epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, is another drug with legitimate emergency medical uses, employed during resuscitation efforts to stimulate cardiac activity. But in excessive doses, or when administered inappropriately, it can cause fatal cardiac arrhythmias. And the combination of these two substances gave Majors a toolkit for killing that was drawn entirely from the medical environment in which he worked, reflecting the way in which healthcare serial killers exploit their professional knowledge and access to commit crimes that would be impossible for those outside the medical system to replicate. The investigation into the deaths at Vermilion County Hospital gained formal momentum when the Indiana State Department of Health began examining the mortality statistics at the facility and determined that the death rate in the intensive care unit during the period of Majors' employment was dramatically elevated compared to both the hospital's own historical rates and comparable facilities in the region. And this statistical finding prompted a referral to law enforcement and the beginning of what would become a major criminal investigation involving the Indiana State Police, the Vermilion County Prosecutor's Office, and eventually federal investigators, as the scope of the inquiry expanded and the methodological challenges of proving the crimes became clear. One of the central challenges facing investigators was a forensic problem of establishing that specific deaths had been caused by deliberate drug administration rather than natural causes. And the approach taken by the investigative team to this challenge was innovative and methodologically significant in ways that extended beyond this specific case, because investigators worked with forensic toxicologists and medical experts to develop and apply analytical techniques for detecting epinephrine and its metabolites in exhumed tissue samples, building on emerging science in the field of forensic toxicology to create an evidentiary framework that could survive the scrutiny of a criminal trial and that could withstand the challenges that the defense would inevitably mount against the reliability and validity of the testing methods employed. The exhumations required for the investigation were numerous and logistically complex, involving the disinterment of bodies from multiple cemeteries in the region, the collection of tissue samples under carefully controlled conditions, and the transportation of those samples to laboratories capable of performing the specialized testing required. And the process was not only technically demanding but emotionally significant for families of the deceased, who were asked to consent to the exhumation of their loved ones and to participate in an investigative process that required them to revisit and re-examine deaths they had believed were natural, confronting the possibility that the person who had been caring for their family member had instead killed them. Majors was suspended from his nursing position in 1995 as the investigation developed, and the suspension removed him from access to patients but did not immediately result in his arrest, as investigators continued to build a forensic case that would be necessary to support prosecution. And during this period, Majors maintained his innocence and presented himself as the victim of unfair suspicion, giving interviews in which he challenged the investigation and suggested that concerns about mortality on his shifts reflected bias against him rather than legitimate evidence of wrongdoing, a posture that would be comprehensively refuted by the evidence ultimately assembled against him. The arrest of Orville Lynn Majors came in 1997, after investigators had completed sufficient forensic work to support charges, and he was charged with 6 counts of murder. The prosecution, having selected these 6 cases as the most clearly supported by the available forensic and circumstantial evidence from among a larger number of deaths that investigators believed he had been responsible for, and the indictment represented the culmination of years of painstaking investigative work by a team that had confronted and overcome significant forensic and evidentiary challenges in building a case against a perpetrator whose crimes had been deliberately designed to be invisible within the normal flow of deaths in a hospital setting. The trial of Orville Lynn Majors took place in 1999 in Vermilion County, and was a lengthy and technically complex proceeding in which the prosecution presented the statistical evidence of elevated mortality on Majors' shifts, the forensic toxicological evidence from exhumed remains, and the testimony of colleagues who described the pattern of deaths and their own growing concerns about what was happening on the unit. And the defense challenged the reliability of the forensic testing, argued that the statistical analysis was being misapplied, and maintained that Majors was innocent of the charges against him. But the jury found the prosecution's evidence persuasive, and after deliberating returned a verdict of guilty on all 6 counts of murder. Judge Bruce Lowell sentenced Orville Lynn Majors to 360 years in prison, a sentence calculated to ensure that he would never be released, that he would spend every remaining day of his life behind bars, and that the possibility of parole or early release will be foreclosed by the sheer mathematical weight of the term imposed. And the sentence was widely regarded as appropriate given the gravity of his crimes and the number of lives he had taken, and Majors remains incarcerated in an Indiana State Correctional Facility, having exhausted his appeals without success and having no prospect of release. The legislative aftermath of the Majors case was substantial and significant, contributing directly to the passage of laws in Indiana and other states that required healthcare facilities to report unusual mortality patterns to regulatory authorities, that mandated more rigorous background checks for healthcare workers, and that established clearer obligations for hospitals and nursing facilities to communicate concerns about employee conduct to licensing boards and law enforcement rather than handling such concerns internally in ways that protected institutional reputation at the expense of public safety. At the federal level, the case contributed to broader discussions about healthcare worker oversight and patient safety that ultimately influenced regulatory policy and the development of national standards for monitoring mortality patterns in clinical settings. Standards that were designed to ensure that the kind of statistical anomaly that had been noticed by colleagues at Vermilion County Hospital, but not acted upon with sufficient speed, would in the future trigger mandatory reporting and investigation rather than internal deliberation and delay. The case also contributed to the development of forensic toxicology as a discipline, with the methodologies developed and validated during the Majors investigation being subsequently applied in other cases and contributing to the body of scientific knowledge about the detection of drugs used in healthcare killings. Knowledge that has proven invaluable in subsequent prosecutions of medical serial killers, and that represents a direct and tangible legacy of the investigative work done by the team that built the case against Majors. For the families of the 6 confirmed victims, and for the families of the additional patients whose deaths investigators believed were caused by Majors, but for whom sufficient forensic evidence could not be assembled, the resolution of the case through conviction and sentencing provided a formal acknowledgement that their loved ones had been murdered and that the person responsible had been held accountable. But the years that elapsed between the crimes and conviction, the complexity of the investigative process, and the knowledge that the institution in which the killings occurred had been aware of concerns about Majors without acting on them with the urgency the situation demanded represented additional layers of pain and injustice that no sentence, however lengthy, could fully address or repair. Orville Lynn Majors killed people who had placed themselves in the care of a medical institution and who had trusted that the people working in that institution were there to help them, people who were already frightened and vulnerable and who deserved the full protection that the healthcare system promised them, and the failure of that system to protect them, the delay in recognizing and acting on the warning signs that were visible to those who worked alongside Majors, and the inadequacy of the regulatory framework that existed at the time to detect and respond to a healthcare serial killer operating in a small rural hospital, are institutional failures as real and as consequential as the individual crimes of the man who exploited them. And the lasting legacy of this case is the ongoing effort to build systems robust enough to detect the next Orville Lynn Majors before he has killed 6 people, or 60 or more, an effort that remains imperfect and incomplete, but that is driven by the imperative of honoring the victims of this case and all the others in the series by ensuring that the vulnerabilities their deaths exposed are addressed with the seriousness and the urgency that they demand, and that the people who trust us with their care their most vulnerable moments deserve without reservation and without exception.